welcome to GovExperts Insights, where we talk about politics, policy, and the practice of both. Today, we're going to be talking about rare disease in children and the impact on families. In particular, we're going to talk a little bit about Prader-Willi Syndrome. And our special guest is Dr. Anish Bhatnagar, the Chief Executive Officer of Soleno Therapeutics. He's a physician with over 20 years of experience in biopharmaceutical and medical device industries. Dr. Bhatnagar's experience spans development of biologics, drugs, drug device combinations, and diagnostics, as well as therapeutic devices. Welcome, Dr. Bhatnagar. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. Nice to be here.
So as we talk about rare disease, I want to kind of frame out a little bit about the impact that it has on families, the impact that it has on our healthcare system, the impact it has, because my understanding is that it's the definition is any disease that affects less than 200,000 people. At least that's the United States definition. And so with over 7,000 different rare diseases identified, 25 to 30 million people in the U.S. currently living with a rare disease. I mean, that's a pretty big impact, even though we're talking about small populations within each of that. So can you tell us a little about the impact on families, our healthcare system, government? It can be extraordinary in terms of obviously the challenges that patient is facing, often very young in life, the cost to a family, the emotional impact on a family, and then the cost of the healthcare system, and then various as our government steps in to try to intervene and help with these types of conditions. With Medicaid and the public payer system. So I wanted to talk about all of that and things, and then recognize too that 90% of these rare diseases don't have an FDA-approved treatment. So let's dig in and talk. And Dr. Bhatnagar, I'll just turn it over to you to kind of talk a little bit about your experience with rare disease and how we got to this point.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Complicated question. Rare diseases, as you indicated, are rare amongst themselves. Each rare disease is a prevalence of less than 200,000 patients in the country. But together, they affect about 10% of the population, which is a very large number. So, the last time that kind of number was affected was the COVID-19 pandemic, and we kind of moved heaven and earth to make things better for the population. And you wonder why same things are not done for a situation like rare diseases. And I think it all boils down to the fact that each of these populations is small. And my experience with rare diseases over the last 6-7 years has been in particular working on this one called Prader-Willi Syndrome, which is a really good example of how small, rare populations can affect entire families. And as you indicated, the healthcare systems, government, et cetera, et cetera. So to tell you a little bit about the disease, Prader-Willi Syndrome is a genetic disease, but it happens spontaneously in about 1 in 15,000 live births. So it is not typically inherited. And what you see is these kids being recognized around the time of birth because they have very low muscle tone. So they're floppy babies. So the physician will pick up that there's something wrong. They'll have a number of tests that will be conducted on them. And within the first few weeks of life, the family will be told that they have a child with Prader-Willi syndrome. They'll also be told that there's not much that can be done for them. Growth hormone, which is approved for these patients, will normalize their stature. So they'll be, tall enough, they'll have reasonable muscle mass, etc. But it won't do anything to impact the hallmark symptoms of the disease, which really affect the patient as well as the families. So as these patients grow older, by the age of about 7 or 8, they will develop what's called hyperphagia. It's an insatiable desire to eat. These kids will never feel full, and a vast majority of them will maintain this for the rest of their lives. This is not hunger as you or I know it. This is hunger as you cannot imagine. This is the brain telling you are starving while you're eating. So these patients will often eat whatever comes their way, 4 pizzas, 20 cookies. You'll have situations where they'll eat things that are not food. They will get into dangerous circumstances where they will eat so much that they can have what's called gastric rupture. So the stomach can actually rupture as well, and it can be fatal. So the only thing that you can do for these kids, young adults, is you can restrict access to food. So these families live with locked refrigerators, locked pantries, etc. They have alarm systems in place, there are locks in place, trash cans are locked, etc. Kids will often not be taken to birthday parties. They will often not be taken to grocery stores or restaurants. And as you can imagine, if your brain is telling you you're starving and you're being restricted access to food, you will have behavioral abnormalities. So they have extreme behaviors sometimes. 911 is called sometimes. They'll go to the ERs for psychiatric emergencies. And this takes a real toll on families. Unaffected siblings will often have PTSD. Families have trouble staying together. And very often, families are unable to take care of these kids, and they will be in institutions where they'll be taken care of 24/7. In general, it's a good example of a rare disease affecting a really small population, but eventually creating problems for the families, creating problems for healthcare systems where they have to be treated in many different ways, see many different experts, and no drugs are available to treat the hyperphagia. So long story, but tough disease and something that's very hard to manage. And like, as you indicated, 90+% of these rare diseases, no treatments available for the hallmark symptoms.
So I know you got your start and did quite a bit of research in cancer, in particularly childhood cancers. And how did you get more focused in regards to the rare disease and particularly the Prader-Willi syndrome?
Yeah, so as you indicated, my early work was in cancer. The first sort of third of my career was in cancer. And it was very rewarding. You know, those were the early days of active and passive immunotherapy. I was working on radioimmunotherapeutic approaches to treating different cancers. And then decided to do something different, started working on drug device combinations and diagnostics, and did some interesting work there. But got more and more interested in what appeared to be one of the biggest problems in healthcare, which was treatment of rare diseases. You know, literally millions of people suffering from these diseases, literally thousands of these diseases, and no treatments available for them. So about 7 years ago, we acquired a small company out of Southern California, which was developing a treatment for Prader-Willi syndrome. They had a small amount of early data, were having trouble raising money. We acquired the company and we raised money around it and have been working on it since then. And I have to say that working with these rare populations is, at least to me, substantially more rewarding than working on even life-threatening cancers. I think the impacts that you can have here are much more significant.
That's yeah, a very interesting journey, and particularly, I wanted to ask in regards to the financing of this research. You said that initially had some issues with finding private sector funding for it. How is that? And obviously, I look out and see several companies on the forefront of rare disease research, and so there's definitely an interest there. But what do you tell investors and things to get them to support your research on this as well as any other rare disease?
Yeah, I mean, 30, 40 years ago, it was rare to work on rare diseases because the populations are too small. And how do you justify large investments? Because our regulations are such that we need to do some very extensive work to get drugs approved for these populations. So about 40 years ago, there was something called the Orphan Drug Act that came into being. And that created incentives for companies to start working on these diseases. There was exclusivity for 7 years, regardless of what your patent status was. And what that led to is this boom of companies working in the rare disease space. The one interesting difference has been that a vast majority of the work in the rare disease drug development space is being done by small companies because these are very high-risk trials with low certainty on what will happen. And the reason investors have invested money in this space is that there is exclusivity for at least 7 years, which means that you can charge more even though the populations are smaller. So what that leads to is revenue situations that can have a reasonable risk-reward ratio for investors. The challenge in recent years has become that the complexity of the regulations for getting these drugs approved is really no different than what the FDA does for the rest of the drugs, whether it's, hypertension or diabetes, there is often not much difference in how these drugs are treated. So as you can imagine, if you apply the same sort of parameters to drugs in a rare disease space, it can be very challenging to justify spending that kind of money. And we are seeing some of those challenges today with the funding environment being very different than what it used to be.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing. And you talked about the federal regulatory system and, it being set up for much larger populations. Maybe expound a little bit on the challenges that rare disease researchers have when trying to advance a therapeutic through the FDA system, realizing too very small populations, very not what the system was designed for to begin with, and tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, the FDA, and I would say, people who work for the government in general, I think do it for a good reason. This is public service. This is not easy. And you're often understaffed, under-resourced, etc. I think the FDA has the tools to provide what we call regulatory flexibility in situations like this, where the unmet need is great, the populations are small. The FDA has the ability to apply flexibility. And we have seen that in some cases. The unfortunate thing has been that there is no uniform application of the regulatory flexibility. So what we struggle with today is having certainty of the outcome, even if you are successful. So for example, if you're running a trial, you and investors would want to know that if it's successful, you can get approval on the basis of it. That's where the regulatory flexibility is not applied uniformly. So it's an interesting situation where the FDA is in some ways hampered by the fact that they are accustomed to dealing with large populations, large data sets, and are having to apply those to small populations and trying to find certainty in the data. But, I think our regulators are equipped to handle these situations. We just need to be able to apply this more uniformly.
So similarly, as you have challenges on the approval side with small populations and rare disease, what's been your experience, or what is your expectation in regards to the payer side of things, both with private, insurance as well as government payers like Medicaid?
Yeah, generally speaking, in the United States, the norm is that if you get a drug approved for a rare disease, so far, it tends to be paid for. And I think that is a huge incentive for companies like ours to continue to do the work. There are significant challenges in other payer systems, like single payer systems in Europe, etc., where you have to go through complex negotiations to figure out, is it going to be reimbursed? How much is it going to be reimbursed? And the fear is that if those sort of systems start to come into being here in the US, it will significantly damage the ability of developers to put the sort of money that you need to put into the regulatory system to approve these drugs. So as of today, I think the system makes sense. I think reimbursement is reasonable. I think there will be a time if all 10,000 diseases suddenly have expensive treatments. That is not a sustainable situation. But that seems like a situation that's very far away. I think today, small populations with no approved drugs, the system can definitely tolerate more approvals and more reimbursement for these drugs. I think at the end of the day, there needs to be a reasonable conversation between companies and payers to figure out what real value is. I think there are drugs that are approved with small incremental values, and perhaps there has to be some sort of value-based analysis of what needs to be paid for. But I don't think we're equipped today to do those sort of things in the US, at least.
Well, it is exciting too, both your research as well as the challenges that it places in front of public policymakers, both at the state and federal level, about payment and research. I know that you're watching closely the Promising Pathway Act, and can you speak a little bit about that and what your expectation is for the impact of that legislation if it were to pass?
Yeah, I see the Promising Pathway Act almost as a sort of cry for help from populations with rare diseases, serious unmet needs, etc. And I think of it less as the act itself and more as a concept that we need more tools, which would allow the FDA to provide more access to drugs early in the process. I think the Promising Pathway Act is one example of a situation like that. I don't know if it'll pass, and I don't know if it'll pass in the form that it is. But I think it's exactly the sort of things that is a conversation starter about what needs to happen. The unmet need is clear. There is no doubt that we need earlier access to promising drugs. The question is, how do you do that? And how do you do that in a way that there is enough regulatory rigor and yet there is early access to drugs? There are examples of this. Europe has a pathway that allows drugs to be approved with the promise of confirmation of efficacy. Um, the US has a similar pathway, although it's a lot more constrained. So it ends up being used almost entirely for cancer drugs. So there's definitely room for improvement. Promising Pathway Act is definitely one way to move forward. And maybe that could be the start of the conversation, which determines with all the stakeholders around the table as to what that pathway looks like.
And so, in your interactions with the patient families that are dealing with Prader-Willi syndrome, obviously they're very interested in your research. You guys have active conversations in regards to that. Do you see them also being engaged on legislation at the state or federal level?
Yeah, I think the PWS community in particular is very engaged. I think there is a realization that you need to be a squeaky wheel. People need to know because rare diseases are rare, so people don't hear of them. They don't realize what the challenges are. So I think patient communities are beginning to realize that they need to really advocate for themselves. And we have seen that. We've seen them be very active in Congress. We've seen them be active at the state level. The problems are different. At the state level, it's often about being designated as a true disability to get access to certain services. Sometimes it's more about payment. At the federal level, it's more about how do you get more drugs approved? How do you get better access to drugs? But yes, a lot of activity from the patient advocacy side.
One of the things that we've seen too, in our experience with the issue, is conveying both the impact that it has on families. Of course, you've got the actual impact of the disease itself, but the emotional toll, the fact that the divorce rate is so high among these families that have to care for a child with special needs. And then as the family faces its challenges, then you've got the question of payers and you've mentioned the need for institutionalization and institutional support and things. That's obviously a cost that is borne by the family or in many cases by the government. So how do we convey to policymakers that this type of research is not only it's both family friendly as well as government program friendly in regards to the fact that it can offset a lifetime of expenses that may have otherwise been experienced?
Yeah, I mean, some of this is research that we as sponsor companies need to do, but it's very important for us to work with the advocacy community in doing this work because they often have access to information that we don't. And I think it's up to all of us to package it for members of Congress, et cetera, to truly understand this because it's a peculiar situation where most people are not aware unless they're actually part of a rare disease or a family that has a rare disease. And we have found that in the case of PWS, for example, people find it very difficult to understand that this is a real problem. This is an overweight child who is hungry all the time. So what's the problem? In fact, it's so much more than that. And unless you actually speak with one of the families who is being impacted with this disease, you won't really understand it. So we've actually found that, part of it is us, and we are unfortunately considered to be conflicted because, we're a sponsor company that stands to make money from this. But we have found that it really is impactful for members of Congress, for senators to actually meet with families, to speak with families. And there was a recent hearing, the Senate Committee on Aging, which was a step in the right direction. There's people who are talking about their real problems, and congressmen, senators are forced to listen to it. And that's how people will realize what the real problems are.
Our experience too has been whenever we can find like a central issue that multiple conditions and family groups can agree upon, that makes it resonate more with elected office holders and policymakers, because they're not having to choose between different groups and merits. The So has that been y'all's experience and things? And I'm assuming too that what my research is on the Promising Pathways Act, that applies across the board to rare disease, and those types of issues are the things that best advance our policy in these areas. Is that?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it is challenging, although Congress has at times been provided preference to certain diseases over others. I think that's not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, but it's more of a challenge for a certain disease state to try and prove themselves to be better, or having more of an unmet need than others. So I agree with you that if you have a piece of legislation that reaches across diseases, that reaches across, serious diseases, rare diseases, unmet needs, define them in a broad way, that's something that people should be able to come around, more easily. The flip side of that, the challenge of that, is that it probably puts a higher regulatory burden on the regulators, because you're dealing with larger situations then. So there's a balance to be had where you define these situations in a specific enough manner that you're not creating a huge regulatory burden, but it's broad enough to cut across the significant unmet needs that we see in different disease states.
And y'all have been working with multiple international governments as well. I think you mentioned the EU and the United States. Is there an international component of this that gets it right? Is there another country that is kind of at the forefront of it? I mean, what's been your experience with the different governments across the globe?
So, I mean, Europe is the EMA, which has, as I was saying, some provisions for doing what's called access to drugs that show promise early on. So they have a pathway which is called conditional approval, where you can have a discussion on what's the condition that you need to meet, that they'll give you approval, you meet this condition, and you can continue to be approved. In the US, we have something called accelerated approval, which unfortunately is driven by two constructs. One is that you need a biomarker, and having a biomarker means that, it's something that determines ultimate efficacy early on. Or you need to have what's called intermediate evidence of efficacy, which provides ultimate evidence of efficacy. Then you prove that in a subsequent study. Unfortunately, the way the US system is structured, almost all drugs that get approved through that pathway are cancer drugs only, because they're better studied, they have better biomarkers. You can do what's called progression-free survival to determine overall survival, which is a very natural way of using these things. Rare disease drugs are almost never approved through that pathway. So there is improvement that is possible in this situation, where you can tailor the existing tools to be more friendly to rare diseases. You can have situations where the FDA can apply regulatory flexibility in thinking about, okay, well, maybe this trial did not meet the endpoint that it was supposed to, but there's enough evidence of efficacy, and this drug appears safe enough, and this is a significant enough unmet need. I think we should approve this drug, provide access, with the proviso that you need to do such and so to continue to be approved. And that's the concept of the PPA. And there is a lot of nuances there, and there's probably better ways to structure ultimate approval. But that should be the way forward, that someone does a comprehensive, honest analysis of risk benefit in situations where nothing else exists.
Right.
and you find a way to provide access early with ultimate approval continuing while continuing evidence is provided.
So let's talk a little bit specifically about Prader-Willi syndrome, and how long has Soleno been focused in on this particular condition, and speak a little bit about your research to date and where you are in the process.
So we have been doing this since 2017. However, as I'd said earlier, we acquired a company that had been doing this for perhaps 10-ish years before that. So what this tells you is that none of this is easy, because you have to not only find an appropriate way of treating a disease, which is not well understood, but you have to raise money in those uncertain times to continue that work. And we acquired this company which was having trouble raising money. We were public at the time, so we had easier access to public markets, although our valuations until recently were very low because of lack of certainty. So people didn't really believe, and it turns out correctly so, that if we just showed promising data that the FDA would actually approve the drug.
Is it lack of certainty related to approval, efficacy, payment, all of the above?
I think, as I was saying, payment seems less of an uncertainty in the US at this time, because not that many drugs get approved, and not that many people are being treated with rare disease drugs. I think it's more about the proving of efficacy and the approval. So I'll give you an example. So typically, when you do trials, you're looking at doing large studies so that statistically you have a higher likelihood of showing success. In rare disease trials, by definition, there aren't enough patients to do those trials. So you end up doing smaller trials, which are inherently structured to have a higher likelihood of not showing success because the population's small. So you're looking for large differences in order to see statistical significance. So you can show up with a p-value that's not less than 0.05, which is a traditional definition of efficacy, but a p-value of, let's say, 0.07, which by a traditional mindset is a, quote, failed study. However, if all you could do was a small trial, and all you could do was find this p-value, nothing else is available to treat those patients, and if the drug is relatively safe, one would argue that someone should take a close look at the data set and perhaps consider approving the drug. That's the challenge. We have seen rare examples of that happen, but the norm is that that does not happen. And the ask really is to bring more certainty to the process and say prospectively that, look, we know that the traditional definition of efficacy is less than 0.05, but we realize that all you can do is, instead of 1,000 patient study, you can do 100 patient study. So let's look at a different statistical paradigm that we will say today that if you hit that, you can be approved, obviously assuming safety works, etc. So that doesn't exist today. What you get today is, we'll see what happens. And that's the challenge.
So for PWS, you have onset, what I believe at around the age of 2, and then how does it manifest? Initially with the family, and then kind of walk us through the cycle of what happens there.
Sure. So PWS actually manifests starting at birth. It's just that the manifestations change over time. So at birth, these kids are diagnosed because they are floppy babies. You pick the child up in the palm of your hand and they kind of drape over on both sides. They have very low muscle tone. So the doctor is going to know something's wrong. They'll end up in the intensive care unit. They'll get a bunch of tests. And one of those tests will be a genetic test for PWS. And the family will know that they have a child with PWS. In the US, they will be started on growth hormone, which will normalize their stature because these kids are all growth hormone deficient. But by the age of 3 or 4, these kids will start to develop an interest in food. They'll talk more about food, they'll ask more about food, and they'll start to develop a disproportionately high amount of body fat and low lean body or muscle mass. By the age of 7 or 8, a vast majority of these kids will have hyperphagia, which is this insatiable desire to eat that we're talking about. This is also the time when they start falling off the normal track at school. So they'll have, in general, the average IQ is in the range of about 70. So many of them will have challenges in school. They will be in special needs classes, etc. They will need to be separated. At lunch times, you'll have to have someone police them. Uh, these kids will rarely get through high school and extremely rarely be in college. Um, if you do go to college, we've often seen one parent quitting their jobs and basically staying with them outside the class to make sure they don't get access to food. So it's a process that will see these kids have a mean life expectancy is around the mid-20s, around 30 years maybe. We're starting to see them be older because you can take care of, cardiometabolic problems, you restrict access to food. But as long as they live, they will need to be supervised. And we have cases with Prader-Willi now in the 40s and 50s and 60s. You can imagine their parents are not around anymore, or if they are, they're unable to take care of them. Mm-hmm. So they live in circumstances like group homes where they need to be supervised. So, there's one type of rare disease where the child will die soon after birth, which is, catastrophic. It's heartbreaking. This is another type of disease where these kids very often will be adults and they live for a really long time, but they'll need to be supervised. And that's a different kind of tragedy.
And at all those stages that you just identified, there are costs that family has to endure, as well as costs for the healthcare system, and costs if they're insured either through the public or private system. Have y'all put a monetary amount on that about because obviously you're looking at how much that costs for the lifetime of that individual, and then what the promise is of a treatment that could change that trajectory?
Yeah, so this sort of health economic work is difficult to do because the systems in which these young adults, children are taken care of are different. Different states have different cost structures. Some states are more supportive of group homes than others. In some states, it's private pay. In some states, some element of it is covered by insurance. So it's a complicated question to answer. But when you talk to these families, having a drug that would allow them to not have to supervise these kids is invaluable. And what we have seen in the long-term data from our study is that we have seen a number of these kids go to 4-year colleges now. And we have seen some of these kids go to the grocery store to buy groceries for their parents. We've seen some kids start to cook their own food. We've seen families have virtually normal lives because of it. So it's hard to put a monetary value to it, but it's certainly work that is being done right now to better understand from a payer perspective, what is it that we are solving for? And, from a family perspective, it's invaluable, but from a health economic perspective, it's work that we're doing now.
Tell us a little bit about the treatment itself. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it, although I think it's commonly known as DCCR. I'll let you describe exactly more detail about it, and what's been focused on, and then what do you see as the promise that's associated with it?
Yeah, so DCCR is a once-a-day pill. It's based on a known parent molecule, which basically means that it's something that's been very well studied in a different form, but similar enough that the side effects are well understood. So early on, it was figured out that this could be useful for PWS. And as we have administered it to probably maybe 130, 140 patients, which seems small, but in a rare disease is actually a very large number, and many of these patients up to 3 to 4 years now. we have seen tremendous benefits in these patients. Hyperphagia scores, there's a caregiver-administered way of measuring them, have come down, to half to a third, which means that these kids very often have almost normal lives. We have seen behaviors, aggressive behaviors, obsessive compulsive behaviors, depressive behaviors improve across the board. We have seen a lot of patients increase in lean body or muscle mass, which is deficient in these patients. And some patients have lost 30, 40 kilograms of body fat. So some of these changes are very obvious. You can see it with your eyes. There are other changes which are more subtle, which the families notice, that they're able to sit together to have a meal, that they're able to go to a birthday party together. They can go to a restaurant sometimes. So those are the more subtle changes. And we have shown this in a phase 3 study, which is the traditional way of proving efficacy. Unfortunately, that study ended around the time COVID was starting. And because these endpoints are subjective, we missed the primary endpoint, which is the traditional definition of efficacy. When we did the analysis excluding the COVID-affected data, the study appeared to be positive. The FDA, however, said they could not exclude that this was an artifact. So we continue to treat these patients, as I said, in some cases up to 3 to 4 years, showing very significant benefits in this open label situation. The FDA asked us to generate additional control data. So we did what's called a randomized withdrawal of drug from these patients. Now, it sounds brutal to take drug away from patients who are doing well, but in a situation where the FDA had not agreed that there was enough evidence, we didn't have a choice. We either had to go and do another study, which have been 3 to 4 years, and raise another substantial chunk of money to try and do that trial, or we could do this randomized withdrawal. So the way this worked is that you randomly, in a blinded manner, switch half the patients to placebo from drug, and you see if the effect goes away. The thesis is that if this is a drug that works, you take the drug away, the effect should go away. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. We saw very significantly from a statistical side that the effect on hyperphagia worsened in patients from whom we took the drug away. Obviously, we put all the patients back on drug, and it wasn't the nicest thing to do. It's something that we discussed extensively with the FDA, with the families who had kids on trial, and with the advocacy organizations. And we said, this is the only way we can generate this data.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. So that's where we are now. We are hoping to file for approval with the FDA somewhere around mid-year next year. And if all goes well, have approval in 2025. So it's
How long were the patients off of the drug when you did that randomized withdrawal?
4 months.
4 months. That's that had to be a really incredibly tough.
It was tough on everyone. It was tough on us as a company to do something like that. It was definitely toughest on the families. It was tough on the investigators who, the physicians who were treating these patients, who were seeing the effects of the drug, to tell these patients that, we have to prove it further. And this is the way to do it.
But as you get past that now, and you're on the eve of being able to apply for FDA approval, you'll go through that process. You have an estimate of how long that will take? So
creating the application takes time. So we expect mid-year by the time we file or we submit the application. We are designated as what's called fast track. So the FDA has 60 days after submission to decide if they will review it or not. And then if they accept it, we should have a 6-month review after that. So early 2025 is one possible timeline.
That is an exciting development, and one that obviously was hard-earned to get to this point. I want to thank you for the research that you've done in regards to this, and y'all's commitment to trying to remedy this rare disease. It's a challenging field, obviously, but an exciting field to be able to see science brought to bear to improve, patients as well as their families' lives. So, on the other side of it, it's got to be a much better place than where we are right now and what we've had to go through.
No doubt. It's been a long road, but hopefully this will do what needs to be done to get it approved.
We wish you the best of luck on that. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you spending time with us today, chatting about, PWS, Soleno, as well as just overall rare disease policy considerations, approval, payers, and legislation. Our listeners are interested in things from a public policy standpoint. Not a lot of times do we get a chance to kind of step back and educate ourselves in regards to particular issues and doing a deep dive on particular topics with someone that's experienced and dealing with it firsthand as the CEO of Soleno. So thank you very much for your time and joining GovExperts Insights. And we look forward to keeping in touch with you, and best of luck on the approval process.
Thank you, Chris. Very nice chatting with you.
Thanks for joining this edition of GovExperts Insights. We invite you to follow this and other episodes at GovExperts.com or on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and our other social media channels.